So I actually saw Star Wars The Force Awakens back in December, but I needed some time to kind of process it, and pretty soon days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and well, here we are. But with the DVD release on the horizon, I thought it was time to finally take a look at this new film. I'll start off by giving you a quick rundown. I really enjoyed this movie. This was the most fun I had in 2015, well, at least at the movie theater. Now, that being said, I don't think it's a perfect film. Quite the opposite. I think there are some pretty big flaws. In fact, if you discount the prequels, I think this is the most flawed Star Wars film yet. That being said, I did really enjoy it, like I said earlier, and I do think you should watch it. If you haven't already, well, you can pick it up on DVD or Blu-ray in a few days. Firstly, I'd like to take a look at some of this film's flaws. The first one is what I'd like to call the Grimoire Syndrome. Named after Destiny. The game Destiny launched, and a lot of people criticized its single-player content as not really having a great story. There was a lot of stuff and a lot of content for the story on the Grimoire, if I'm pronouncing that right, which I'm probably not, which was an external website filled with, collectibles and stuff that would tell the backstory. But the trouble is, you had to leave the game to read it, which is stupid. And the same thing kind of applies here. There's a lot of backstory in the Star Wars universe. Literally, from the opening crawl, we're presented with some interesting new directions the narrative is taken. The trouble is, a lot of these aren't really explained, and there are some parts of the story that are just flat out boring because you don't really understand the stakes of what's going on. Apparently, a lot of these are fixed in books, the new Star Wars books that have been released and tell a lot of these stories and give you a lot of background that apparently really makes the film even better. But I shouldn't have to go read a book to understand what's going on in a Star Wars film. I'll give you an example. There's one point in which a star system is destroyed with a Death Star-like plot device. Well, you know nothing about this star system. You don't care about it at all. You're just kind of like, meh. Now, I later found out that in the books it explains a lot, and in some of the materials that support the film, the nature of this system is explained, and it makes a whole lot more sense, and that moment has a lot more weight. But I didn't know that when I was watching it. And there are a lot of other things here. The entire setup of this movie is kind of like, wait, what? How did it get this way? Again, told in the books, but I'm not reading the books, I'm watching the movie. So I'm underwhelmed by that, and I do wish they hadn't relied so heavily on that. I suspect some of this backstory will come through in Episode 8, but again, Episode 7, lacking that. The next flaw, I think, is something I'd like to call the blockbuster syndrome. Same thing happened to the new Star Trek movies. Yeah, they're cool. Yeah, they have a lot of great stuff in them. But when you compare them to some of the Star Trek movies that came before them and the Star Trek TV series, well, they don't hold up very well because they've kind of been blockbusterized with lens flares and CGI and all this stuff. And the same thing kind of happened to Star Wars. Again, the movie's very good, and they certainly did a lot of effort. They put a lot of effort into making this not feel so much like a modern blockbuster. Try to hark back to the days of Episode 4, 5, and 6. But there are times when it comes through. There's still some CG, and some of it's not great, I'm not gonna lie. Most of it's pretty good, but there are times when it's clear this took influences a little too much from modern cinema. This doesn't ruin the film by any means, but it's something to watch out for, and something I am a little concerned about going into Episode 8. The third major flaw is one that a lot of people have talked about. Basically, the film is very similar to the original trilogy, to the point where you can kind of recite the plot, and that's basically the plot for Episode 7. The plot of Episode 4, that is. And that's a little disappointing. I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of hoping they'd go in a new direction with this and show us some stuff that they really haven't before. And they have on some parts of it, but others seem to be ripped straight out of episode 4, and that can be a little disappointing at times. To be fair, I understand why they did this. Episode 4 is a great film, and in doing the episode 7 this way, they're trying to establish that they can make a solid Star Wars film without doing too much new for fear of upsetting the fans, like the prequels did. So I understand it, but that does still make it a little bit disappointing in a few places. Still, it's not too bad, and honestly, there are far worse films to copy. And the final issue is kind of a non-issue, honestly. People on both sides of the political spectrum have criticized this, either for having too much gender politics, or too little, or just promoting things they don't agree with, from racists and sexists, and honestly, this film never struck me as having a political tone at all. It's just a good Star Wars movie, guys. You know, there really isn't any political side to this that I could see. So, yeah, it never felt like it was pushing a political agenda on me. So, I'm not going to complain at all. Honestly, I'm really kind of glad there have been some statements and decisions in other materials that I don't necessarily agree with regarding various politics, but thankfully those have not spilled over into the series, and it remains just a good movie without having to worry about, being preached to about, well, politics. So now let's talk about what the film got right. The effects. They put a lot more emphasis on physical props and various other practical effects as opposed to CGI, which is great. When CGI is used, with one or two major exceptions, it's really well used. It's subtle. You'd barely know it was CGI if it wasn't impractical to use practical effects there. That being said, there are 2 characters and 1 creature that are done in CG. One of the characters is fine, not super distracting, not great, but not perfect. But one of the characters and one of the creatures, it's bad. It takes you out of it. Disappointing Disney. You should have paid him a little bit more. Another thing they did right was the characters. Like, the characters are good, they're likable, they're interesting, they have kind of mysterious backstories, a lot of them, and they give us just enough to keep us entertained. They were acted very well. This entire film is acted very well, with both the returning characters and guest stars, I shouldn't say guest stars, the new characters as well. Yeah, it's really hard to criticize that. They did an excellent job there. The overall plot is quite good. It's very entertaining, and I don't really have any huge criticisms, with the possible exception that they kind of, as I noted earlier, went with a Death Star-like plot device, and this is like the 3rd time we've seen that. So a little bit tiresome, but again, very good overall. There's a ton of nostalgia here. Everything here, it's clear that the people who made this were big Star Wars fans, and they really wanted to make something in the vein of Star Wars, and they succeeded brilliantly. There's 1 character death. It was handled pretty darn well, I've got to be honest. It's one of those things that you see coming, but it's still very poignant. There's quite a twist. I don't know how the advertising department pulled this off. The previews, well, let's just say, I don't want to spoil it, but the film is not about who you may think it's about. Pardon me. Yeah, that's just a really interesting storyline overall. Good, solid first attempt. Now, that being said, the villain is probably the weakest part. Kylo Ren, as you've probably seen from the previews, there are a lot of good moments, and it's kind of the exact opposite problem of Anakin Skywalker. Like, Anakin Skywalker, the actor that got Hayden Christensen, he looked mean and scary, but he couldn't really act, or at least he didn't act well in those films. Here, the opposite is true. You have an actor who does a really pretty solid job with what he's given. I wasn't ecstatic about it, but it was pretty good. But he just does not look scary, and a lot of people are saying, well, it's supposed to be like that, etc., etc. But I don't agree. I think a villain should look scary, and I'm honestly a little disappointed, because he's basically the main villain in this movie, Kylo Ren, and he's basically what we've seen before. Little disappointing. Was kind of hoping there would be a more charismatic villain who's a little bit more tactical, who's not so just, I'm evil for the sake of being evil. Hopefully that will be coming in episode 8. There's been a lot of rumors, so hopefully that's coming. So ultimately the villain's a little bit on the weak side, but to be fair, Star Wars has just never had really great villains, in my opinion. Yeah, the Emperor and Vader were both great, but ultimately they were both pretty simple, fairly one- or two-dimensional. I mean, the Emperor is just evil because, evil. And Vader is sort of the prodigal son. And it worked well, but it wasn't exactly super in-depth or super deep, I guess. So, ultimately, I thought they did a fine job, certainly sufficient, but I think they could do maybe a little better in the future. Now, it sounds like I'm being heavily critical of this film, and I am. There are a lot of technical flaws, in my opinion, but ultimately, if you're wondering whether I think this is a bad movie, as I said earlier, it's not. It's a lot of fun, and even if I do see some of these technical flaws that I think bring this down from where it could have been, this is just fun. You really do need to see it. That's the only way I can describe it. It's a rush. If you're a fan of Star Wars, this is a must-see. In fact, you've probably already seen it. If you haven't, dang, what are you waiting for? Well, as soon as it comes out on DVD and Blu-ray, then give it a watch. Give it a rent. Or buy it, even. I'd actually recommend buying this one. It's that good. It's good enough, and I think you are going to get a lot of value out of that. And I don't recommend many things for purchase. So, those are my thoughts on Star Wars Episode 7. What do you think? Tell me in the comments below. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, or a dislike if you didn't. And please consider subscribing. It helps the channel a lot. Thank you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.